I can.
Hi, Gabi. Thank you.
Hello, hello. Yes, thank you, Hedy. This was a really lovely introduction today. So you must say, Khanh, it was lovely the way Hedy started the session, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, talking about the pertinence of questions and open-mindedness, right, of people. So it was really nice. I really liked your video. I mean, questions, teaching through questions is the passion of my life. So it happens that it's the topic of your presentation, Khanh. So I'm going to be bombarding you with questions. Now, let me start, if I may, or perhaps before I ask you the first question, maybe we can look at, because I know we've had some comments on the forum, Hedy.
Yeah.
And also there are 2 questions in the Q&A. So yeah, I can wait with my questions, okay? The priority is the people who are here with us today. So where do we start, Khanh?
Let's start with the first question. It's actually a very basic question, and it's a question that we also ask ourselves sometimes, isn't it? Why do we need to ask questions? So that's from the Q&A. Why do we need to ask questions? I mean, we're teaching. So isn't teaching instructional? Shouldn't we just say, let's read this text, let's answer, you know, these comprehension questions? Why do we as teachers even bother, you know, with so much question asking? Well, I find that we ask questions to keep our students with us. I find that if you have a lesson that's just frontal, you know, frontal instruction with lots of input, and whatever questions you ask, you know, you ask questions to check, to stop and check if they're still with you. You ask questions at certain points to show that you're finishing up one thing and moving on to the next. So we ask questions as signposts, as markers. Heidi, in her introduction, also said that we ask questions all the time, right? So some of the other questions that we ask in our class are authentic questions. You know, how are you feeling today? If we know that the class had a football match yesterday, an inter-class match, we could, you know, make polite conversation and say, how was your match yesterday? That's giving our students the authentic practice in using language in authentic situations. It doesn't always have to be, you know, pedagogical questions like what's the past tense of eat.
I can tell you why I ask questions. Would you like to ask me why I ask questions?
Why do you ask questions, Gabi?
So the reason why I ask questions, it's one of the reasons, Khanh, but I think that one of the reasons why I ask questions is because I don't like to be ignored by my students. So what happens is if you just stand there and you start preaching, okay, you never know how much the students are getting out of it, and you never know who is asleep and who is actually processing what you're saying, right? There's no knowing.
Exactly.
But if you start asking questions, you can be absolutely certain that nobody can ignore you, because a question engages students. A question keeps them on their toes. And this is the reason, I think this is how I actually, or this is why I started teaching this way, you know, because 20 something or 30 years ago, when I actually started teaching, I didn't start by asking questions. I was just a teacher straight off the CELTA course who was teaching, right? And most teachers and most students understand teaching as what? As explaining,
input, instructions.
And then at some point I realized that I was not getting enough attention, and I like to be getting attention, right? Don't get me wrong, when I'm in the classroom. So I kind of realized that I was not keeping my students fully engaged. And then I discovered that by asking questions, you actually have your students, you are with them. It's the, with itness that I like to refer to. So this is the reason why I ask questions. I wonder what people here have to say to this. I mean, how did you, Khanh, how did you come to this kind of understanding, to this realization that teaching should actually be, teaching is more effective when it's done through questioning? How did you get there?
It's exactly the same way. There's exactly the same thing that you've realized. I mean, I've taught a range of classes, small, up to 20 students in a communicative language class. I've taught lectures and modules on the English language, and I've noticed the way you do, you could just stand there and give instructions, give input, explanations, draw rules up on the board and things like that. But if you don't stop and check, I mean, what happens in the end is that you're just that person at the front of the class. It also may perhaps show students that, or to put differently, students might get the feeling that you're not interested in them. You're just interested in being the person up there, showing off all your knowledge. And I've discovered the exact same thing as you. I ask questions to make sure that they're still following. I ask questions to engage with them as well. And also, for me, very importantly, I've discovered that because every class is different, every student prepares differently, I can only find out where I am in a lesson by asking questions, and not just questions like, so are you all prepared, but more precise questions, either polar closed or more open questions to find, so that they can demonstrate to me that, yes, they are also with me. It kind of leads into what one participant was saying in the Q&A, or was asking, how do we keep our students engaged throughout? And it's through using questions that we keep them engaged.
Yes, because
they can't switch off. They can't switch off.
Yeah, that's what it is, because I mean, and this is how we are. All of us are the same. So as students, if people talk to us or talk at us, it's very easy to just switch off. In particular, when you at some point kind of, it's not like you lose interest, but you lose track of what is being explained. So so this is, so I mean, that's my experience. In my experience, the best way to keep students engaged throughout the lesson is to ask questions, but not only to ask questions, but to also get students to ask you questions. And this is my question for you. Because it goes both ways, right? So it's not only the teacher asking questions, but it's also students asking you questions. So so you see, what I often do with my students is what I did with you 2 minutes ago, when I said, would you like to know? And then you said yes, and I said, well, then ask me. So this is how I do it in the classroom very often with my students, okay? Because obviously, if I say, would you like to know? And students say yes, and then I keep talking, right? So you kind of stop this, and then the ball is in their, I don't know, field, and they have to now ask me the question, which is interaction. So how do you engage your students? How do you get them to ask you questions, and what questions do you get them to ask you? How do you go about that?
I read something in a book by Tessa Woodward called Thinking in the EFL Class, and one strategy or one idea that I found in the book, which has worked very well for me. And we have to be careful here, because it may work well for me, not so much for others, but it works well for me because my students are intermediate level and higher. So you have to be careful with this example that I'm going to give you now. Because they've come into class with a good level of knowledge, right? And let's say we're doing a grammar / personalized lesson on talking about the future. Okay, and we've got different forms in the English language to talk about the future. And what I would get my students to do is I'd get them to think about what they don't know. So not so much me asking them, what do you already know? But because my learners very often, they're not very confident, even though they're intermediate and higher, they would always say, no, I don't know anything about this. And that's why I'm here. And I want you to teach me these constructions. So I turn it around and say to them, well, for you to tell me that, you know, you don't know anything, I'd like you to be more precise. What exactly? So they have to list then a series of questions about that particular structure that they'd like me to answer. Or if we were doing something about presentation skills, I'd ask them, because they've done presentations, you know, throughout their studies already or at secondary school, I'd ask them to ask me questions specific to giving presentations. And that's actually getting them to think precisely about where the gap in their knowledge is, and then to ask me to be the guide to help them fill that gap in the knowledge, rather than to come to me and say, I don't know anything about presenting.
Yeah, yes. You know, this actually, I was listening to you thinking, because at some point you said in your presentation, you said, you mentioned loud students. So you mentioned students who always volunteer answers, right?
Yeah.
And you said, don't accept immediate answers, wait, right? So, but, and this kind of, I wanted to ask you this question later, but since you are mentioning, you were just telling us how to generate questions from students. You know, the way to kind of deal with loud students, the students who always have the right answer, at least in my experience, is to not to ask for right answers, but again, do it twisted. And what I always do is, don't give me the right answers, okay? The first people to speak are the people who think have wrong answers, and the people who think they still have doubts. So this way, you kind of, the best students, the loudest students have to stay quiet, right? Because they are absolutely sure they have the correct answer. So they are not allowed to give me the answer. So we start with wrong answers. And this way we rule out the wrong possibilities. And the last people to speak are the people who think have the right answers. So how do you feel about that? Because I think it's quite nice. I mean, it works in the classroom.
I've never tried that. I've tried a different one where when I put them into groups with the questions, I get the stronger students to be the question askers. And they're not allowed to answer the question until their group mates have answered. So then, you know, obviously you have to know your class well. So you pair up, you know, you have a good balance of weaker and stronger students in a group, with the stronger students being kind of like the moderator or the chair. They have then that role in asking the questions, in helping the others get to the answer. And I find that any strategy that you try, you have to be careful with that, because a class that you've never taught. I've had students that, you know, I always get new students in October and in April. And those who don't know me, in the first 2 weeks, they just think, well, why is this teacher asking us so many questions? I mean, she's here to give us the answers. Why is she wanting to the answers from us. Why is she asking us the questions? But any new strategy you use in your teaching, if it's a new class, you have to take them through it slowly. You have to, you know, explain the rationale, and I've done that. I tell my students how my class is based, what my teaching philosophy is based on. And then as you go on through the course, you'll find that once they've grasped, you know, what you're doing, like the, you know, group work where the strongest students are the chairpersons or the moderators, or that you're always asking them questions at the beginning of the session, that's your strategy. They tend to be more accepting of it. And then after a while, you'll find that there's such a dynamic. You've actually built a rapport and you've built a dynamic because your students have then also discovered that your class is a safe place, that the weaker ones will know that you're not only chasing for the right answers, but that you're there for them if they haven't got to the right answer.
Yes, and again, I'm listening to you thinking this is such a pertinent, such a valid point that you've just made about, I'm going to use this word again. I know it's not the nicest word, but we train our students by kind of, it's behaviorism, right? So it's like we create this environment. So once we, what you said, that you are very explicit about why you do things, you involve students in kind of understanding why you do things this way and not another, and you know, this way you create the right environment, the kind of environment that your students actually understand. So it's not imposed on them. So it's dialogic in a sense, and it's so important because if you want to teach by questions, again, it goes both ways because it's the teacher asking questions and it's the students asking questions. It's not something that you can do on the first day with a new group. You have to prime your students. You have to create the right environment. It's a process, right? Would you agree with me?
Definitely. I wanted to pick up on something else as well. I mean, we've been talking about dialogic questions up to now, but there's something also that I touched on in my input session, and we've got also a comment that somebody's put in, which I think, you know, in class, we've got these dialogic questions that lead to learning, you know, these Socratic questions, but we have to also realize that in real life, there are a lot of authentic questions as well. When our students travel abroad, or they, you know, use English in an English language setting in a supermarket, at the train station, if they're gone abroad, staying with a host family, they get asked questions. How did you sleep last night? Or at the supermarket, is that all? You know, at the end of their, you know, if they've put everything on the, at the cashier, at the checkout, or, you know, social conversations, somebody talks about something and you get a hypothetical question, you get, well, what would you do? So these aren't dialogic questions, but our students still need to know how to respond to such authentic real life questions, and they also need to know how to ask such questions. So I do get my students also, when we're in class and let's say the classroom is hot, that rather than them saying, I want to open the window, I ask them to formulate it as a question, maybe direct that question to somebody else. So, you know, to mimic an authentic situation, like, excuse me, would you mind if I open the window? Or if they were too far from the window, they could say, sorry, John, could you open the window, please? So we have to remember that it's not just questions that demonstrate learning to us, but also we need to give them that opportunity to use language.
Yeah, this is beautiful, Khanh. I mean, you know, you sound like someone who uses task-based learning, you know, in your teaching. So yeah, I mean, creating this opportunity. And I love this idea of, because what we do immediately, we ask, if it's too hot in the room, we say, oh, John, Brian, could you open the window? But the truth is, it's not your time, it's your students' time. So you should use this, you should see this opportunity as a learning opportunity and a teaching opportunity. So you get your students to create the questions. So I absolutely love this approach. Since we are already talking about authentic questions, because it was in your presentation, this authentic language, okay? Okay, we create opportunities for students to ask questions, but we often ask those questions ourselves, and not just questions, but we try to use this authentic language when we make comments like bless you, or when something happens, right, we use authentic language, ungraded language, because students need it. But, you know, I've always thought that this creates a little bit of an issue, okay? Because when using authentic language and using authentic questions, very often it's lost on students. Or better still, maybe it's not lost because students can understand you, but they are not fully noticing it. So my question is, how do you actually utilize this opportunity? How do you get them to notice when you say bless you to one student or some other authentic, you know, language comment? How do you get your students to notice this?
I have a little thing that I do. I don't know if it's effective, but my students keep a little exercise book, right? Their little vocabulary notebook. And we've got a routine where I write on the board a set number of formulaic phrases that I think will occur in class today. So if we have a game where I know a session where I know we're going to play a board game, so I'll have words like phrases like it's your turn, or something like could I go to the toilet please? You know, I mean, you've got to know your class, and you've got to be, you know, it also takes a lot of prep because you have to kind of put yourself before class into the classroom situation. And I have just 5 or 6 phrases, and I get them very blatantly. I say, if you can, you know, these are the phrases that I'd like you to look out for. See if we, you know, anybody in class says these phrases. So I've got students who come late at the moment. We've got a lot of bus problems, so I have a lot of students coming late, and I ask the students to kind of look out for what their classmates say when they come in, or how I respond to them. And it's quite interesting because sometimes my responses, they're so formulaic that I don't even realize that I say it. And my students have, you know, said to me, oh yeah, well, you know, we usually review the last 5 minutes of class, and they said, oh yeah, today you said when they came in late, just doesn't matter, just sit down, or things like that. And I mean, it does take a little bit of class time. For some students, it might be a bit tedious, but as we go through the course, I actually kind of nominate a student per session to make these formulaic responses. So that if I have my serial latecomers, then I'll have something like a class monitor who will say, it's okay, take your seat, or we haven't started yet, and things like that. Or
because I always because obviously as a teacher you really want to take every single opportunity that arrives in the classroom to feed this language to your students, right? This real language. But I often feel that some students will be ready for this, so they will take notice of it, a mental note, they will make a mental note of it. But some students will just kind of in and out, okay? So and then I consider it an opportunity lost, okay? So, and I always struggle with this, like how to get your students to notice, how to make them see this real interaction. And not only in terms of the language you use, but also in terms of how you say it. So your intonation, right? So every little thing that is so important. and things that students will not learn from course books, because it's not, even though it's contextualized, it's not really contextualized, right? Because the context
they've not seen it.
Yeah.
We've got some people who've put up their hands.
And we have more questions in the Q&A box, Khan, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to pick up on the last one. So we talked about the hypothetical question. The last person mentioned that they'd done a story about, and then the students were asked the question, what would you do if you were the wolf? The question being, is this a type of hypothetical question? The structure is that of a hypothetical question, but it's not hypothetical on its own because it's linked to a story. So I would say that if it's linked to the story, so the students got some background, they've got some schema to build upon. They've read about the wolf's behavior, whatever it was the wolf had done. So then they can link to that. But if you just, put them into groups and say to them, what would you do? Without actually thinking whether they've got any context to fall back upon, then that is then a true hypothetical question, which your students might find difficult to answer. So you've got to provide the schema knowledge if you're doing that kind of thing. I hope that answers.
So as if I understand this correctly, Khan, so it's not as much about whether the question is actually hypothetical, but it's the case of not contextualizing it properly.
Exactly. Yeah. We have another one about giving advice on how to help the students to ask questions, to engage them in asking questions. It depends on what kind of questions you want them to ask. Students, I know the world over, many students are very afraid of asking questions that demonstrate their lack of knowledge. They don't, they don't want to seem like they're the ones who don't know. And especially if they feel that their peers have all the questions. What I do, a good way to get them to ask questions would be to perhaps do it on paper. You can give them little slips of paper and ask them to write, one question or more that they have about the lesson or about the topic that they would like addressed again in the next session or in the following session. That way that's anonymous because, it's the focus isn't on them not knowing, but the focus is more on their questions. So that's one way of getting them to ask questions about content. If you want to give them practice in asking authentic questions in conversation, if you have the time at the beginning of your class and you've put your students into groups to chat for 5 minutes, you can, say to them that before they get into their groups, every learner has to write 2 questions that they'd like to ask their classmate about anything. And I usually say 2 questions because when they get into their groups, I always tell them that if a question's been asked already, they cannot ask that same question. So you can't have, if you have a group of 4, you can't have everybody asking everybody, so how was your morning? So, and then if you tell them to only prepare 1 question, they have nothing to fall back on. So if you give them that, time to prepare, list their questions, and then give them that authentic, social situation to chat, that helps. So that was the one question.
Yeah, I mean, it's so important to, I always try to, I always make my students ask questions and also ask each other. Always. I just say, well, ask this person about her holiday. Ask, every single day I start my lesson by saying, now talk to your partner and ask them what they had for dinner yesterday, who was cooking, what they had for dinner, how their evening went and all this. So this is how they start each lesson. And it's just, it's very, it's creating the safe environment. You know, I've been meaning to ask you, do you ever praise your students or thank your students for mistakes? Like when students make mistakes, do you ever say thank you for this? Because that's another thing I do. I always acknowledge mistakes more than good answers. And when students make an error, make a mistake, I always say thank you very much for this, because thanks to you, we can now do, you know, kind of resolve an issue. Now you are opening my eyes to a situation. So errors create learning opportunities. So really, students who make mistakes should be thanked more than the ones who provide good answers.
Well, honestly, I don't thank them because culturally, I mean, here in Germany, it's just not the done thing. I mean, I don't scold them for their mistakes. I do, you know, if I've got students who've answered where I see their mistakes in something or other. So this week we did academic writing and we did quoting. So you have 3 ways of quoting, using direct quotes in your writing, with putting the reporting clause at the beginning, like Smith says, then whatever Smith says, the sun is hot, then you can say the sun is hot, says Smith, and the sun says Smith is hot, right? And you notice in the first structure, you have the subject and the reporting verb, but in the other two, you have the reporting verb and then the subject. And when my students were working on that, I did notice that many of them use the same subject plus verb structure, regardless which style of direct quote they use. I didn't thank them for making that mistake, but I did highlight, and I said, okay, I've noticed that quite a number of you struggled with that. Let me just highlight again. And that's, I mean, it's a very cultural thing. I think there are some things that you just don't do in some cultures, but it's more acceptable in other cultures.
Yeah, I'm really mindful of the time. We only have 15 minutes and I have loads of questions, but I really, as I said, we have to answer the questions coming in from the people watching us.
I have one thing here where let's stay with the wrong answers or the mistakes, and we have here a participant who says that sometimes they use the wrong answer of one student and turn it into a discussion where students correct their peers. That's something I do a lot, where I turn the question to them, where, let's say, you know, if you have a student, a common mistake that many German speakers make when they speak English is with the past perfect and the past simple. So you'd have a German speaker say, last summer I have been to Spain. So you have, first of all, last summer, which is an indicator for finished past time, and you should actually be saying last summer I went to Spain. So I would turn that around and I'd say the sentence isn't quite correct. I know what you're trying to say here, but let's look at it together. Why do you think this sentence isn't correct? And I'd open it to the whole class, or I'd say, you know, how do you think this sentence could be fixed or could be made better? And then through something like that, then I as a teacher will see, you know, who's got it and who hasn't. And I get them to ask me for clues. I tell them, I say, I'm not going to tell you what's wrong with the sentence. So if you want to know, if you want to be led to the answer, you have to ask me. So then, you know, I'll have students saying, has it got to do with the verb, or has it got to do with the time adverbial, and things like that.
Yeah, so I love this question that we ask our students. Ask me. It's not even a question, you know, it's imperative. Ask me. If you want to know, ask me.
Yeah.
Khanh, let me ask you this question, the question that I really meant to ask you at the very beginning of the session. Okay, in my class, we use I wonder, where students have time to ask questions to the teachers. If they do not ask questions, the teacher formulates questions and asks them to answer. How do you mean? Can you talk to us?
Yes, Caitlin, elaborate, share with us the strategy.
If they don't, maybe he means open questions, so which students have a wide range of space to answer the way they want and produce ideas. So maybe these are the productive questions, where open questions, where students have to generate ideas.
Mm.
That could, yeah,
that was me.
Yeah.
But I'd like to hear about the I wonder questions.
Hi, good evening. Yeah, it's evening here in the Philippines. And good morning, everyone. So the I wonder is like a strategy where we do that in class, wherein the students will have time. It's like a thinking time where they can formulate questions regarding the lessons that we have there. And then after that, if they don't have any questions, if they cannot formulate a question, or they just shy to ask questions, I'm the one who will ask them questions that will lead them, or that will engage them, or help them to formulate, or to do follow-up questions regarding the activity. Yeah, it's something like I see, I think, I wonder. And so we do that before the class, or after the class, or in between the activity, something like that. And because I'm not teaching English, I'm teaching a skill subject. So we use that kind of strategy just to help the students formulate questions, okay, and to engage more, to engage them also in the activity. Yes.
This is also involving high
order thinking skills.
Right? The strategy, because I think I may have seen it somewhere, and I remember this was in the context of using thinking skills.
Yeah.
Yes, Khan?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, so, but of course, it's a way of helping students to generate more questions, right? So, so I think it's a very, very effective and very useful technique in the English classroom as well, EFL classroom. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing.
Thank you.
Now, someone is asking if you could give an example of information check questions, Khan.
Yep. Instruction check questions. If I interpret your questions correctly, you mean you're checking if your learners have understood your instructions. So, I mean, what I do is, let's say I've given them a worksheet, and I told the class, I'd like you to work in groups of 3. I need you to answer this and this questions, and you've got 5 minutes. So my instruction check questions would be something like, I could ask them, depending on the class, I could either say how many students should be working together, or are you allowed to work in a group of 5? And then they could say, no, we're not allowed to. And I'll go, how many, what's the maximum size in your group? Which questions on this worksheet are supposed to answer? When should you be finished? And those are the kind of questions that you could ask to check if your students have understood your instructions. Definitely not to say, have you understood? Do you know what to do?
Can I share something with you? I never ask instruction check questions. Do you know why? Because you see, this is something I have been doing for many years now, and it works for me. Okay, so let me just share it with you. So what I do is I always show students the material, and I kind of tell them, okay, so this is a reading, this is a listening, or whatever that's. And then I essentially ask, what do you think I'm going to ask you to do? And then in pairs, they, you know, very quickly kind of brainstorm, because they've already had so many lessons that they, you know, more or less know what I will be asking them. And they tell me, so you are now going to ask us to read the text. Well, yeah, okay, but how are you going to read this? How do you think I'm going to ask you to read this? Okay, we will be first reading individually. So it's like, you know, I ask them what they have to do, and then at the end, we just summarize it. So did you say that you will be doing this and this and this? So instead of kind of telling them and then checking, I just asked them, what do you think I'm going, because what surprised me once was that one of the students gave me the answer that I never even would have imagined. And this inspired me to actually run this activity that way, because it came from a student.
Yeah, I mean, it depends though. We've got different types. I mean, that's a very good strategy. Definitely something that I might try next. And like you say, you've set the context that you've done these things, you know, you've given them a worksheet. But we have other situations where we give instructions such as room changes, or last week or the week before, I was in Belfast for the conference, and my students never listen when I give them information about, you know, certain changes. So of course I had said to them at the beginning of class that the following Tuesday, the lesson's canceled, and then we've got a holiday and we're back on this day. And what I did then, in this case, I had to, you know, to ensure that they understood. I mean, as a teacher, you could say, pick on somebody to ask them to tell the class, retell the information. But because I noticed that there were students who weren't listening or who didn't seem to be listening, then I did ask them, you know, individually, have we got a class next week? When's our next class? And where are you going to find the information and the tasks for the period that I'm gone, or what are you supposed to do? So you see, you've got
it only, sorry to interrupt, it only reinforces the message you communicated earlier, that everybody's kind of circumstances and are different, right? So we cannot just blindly take strategies from another teacher, because they may not work for our students. So we have to be open-minded. We need to be on a lookout for more, you know, effective strategies and ideas, but we have to always think about our own teaching scenarios and our own students.
We have one last question. Actually, we have two, but I have one last question that I'd really like to answer. Piyumika has asked that some students are silent if, you know, if she asks questions or something from them, and they're afraid to talk or to keep silent, and what could we do in this situation? And my advice is really something that I covered actually at the end of my input session, where, you know, with your stronger students, you could ask more open question, and with your less confident student, you could work with either the polar closed questions, where you've already given them a choice to pick between, you know, two possible answers. So that's you. I mean, it takes a lot of practice to kind of remember, and maybe for you as a teacher, sometimes you think, well, this question, the answer to this question is so obvious, you know, why should I? But if you have the situation that you describe, where you've got students who are so afraid to answer, who are really shy, who are less confident, then use the polar closed questions. And as they get better, you could use the WH closed questions. And then, you know, for your even stronger students, you can use the totally wide open questions.
Yes, it has been an absolute pleasure, Khanh. Before Hedy steps in, okay, I just have to say it. It was really, it was lovely, the session, the practical ideas and the passion, you know, that you just ooze. It's absolutely lovely. Thank you.
I'm sorry we didn't get to answer everybody's questions.
But we have the forum, so if somebody has some questions left, you can post them on the forum and then you may get an answer.
You will get an answer.
Yeah. Well, Sammy is really, she's really after the, she posted this question and she really wants to know the answer, I think. So
Yeah.
can we answer this, Hedy? Can answer this?
Yes, please.
Sammy is asking, have you come across any unanswerable questions from your students?
And how I manage that? Yes,
Yes.
I mean, I've come across different types of unanswerable questions. They could be questions related to administrative things with which I have no answer. So I just point my students to the people who can answer questions. I've got questions about language or content that I'm unable to answer. So, you know, I've students who've asked me things about a koala, you know, when we did a lesson on Australia and what do koalas eat? And I personally don't know what koalas eat. So, you know, you just admit that you don't know the answer. And maybe as a class, now that we have tech, you know, a lot of tech in class, you know, we can work on that together. I've also got I've had students who've asked me very personal questions that they're also the kind of unanswerable question, right? Personal questions. It's up to you then as a teacher, do you want to answer this, you know, very private question or not? I usually tell my students, because I have quite a good rapport with my students, I tell them our friendship is not at that stage yet. Give us another couple of months and maybe I'll answer that question. You know, you just have to be honest with them.
Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly. Thank you so much, Khanh-Duc, and for your presentation and answering all these questions. And Gabi, thank you so much for being here and helping, you know, Khanh to keep this conversation going. So it was
No, it was a pleasure. It really was.
Yeah.